Welcome to the Champions Chess Tour Finals. We've got a fantastic matchup here between the young German prodigy Vincent Keymer and the super solid American star Wesley So. Let's dive in. Keymer opens with pawn to c4 and So meets it with e5. A very solid, symmetrical English setup unfolds as both players develop their knights and stake a claim on the queen side. After another developing move, So strikes in the center with the pawn push to d5. Keymer accepts the challenge, and we have our first pawn trade of the game. And Wesley So finds the perfect response. The knight recaptures on d5, and this is the only move that keeps Black's position looking very comfortable and slightly better. But Keymer has a brilliant idea. He sacrifices a pawn with the push to e4. This is a fantastic concept, blowing open the center to challenge Black's control and create immediate attacking chances. So accepts the sacrifice, trading knights. Both sides develop their bishops and get their kings to safety by castling, and then So puts the pressure on with a pin, bringing the bishop to g4. Keymer isn't having any of it. He immediately challenges the bishop with the pawn push to h3, and after it retreats, he kicks it again with g4. And Wesley finds the perfect square. The bishop drops back to g6, the only move to keep his slight edge, eyeing the long diagonal and staying active. Now we enter a phase of deep strategic maneuvering. White expands on the queen side, while Black shores up the structure. Queens, kings, and bishops all find better squares as both sides prepare for the coming middle-game clash. The dance continues. Queens are repositioned, and both players reroute their knights. Keymer's hops to h4, while So's knight begins a journey from d8 over to e6. Keymer puts his knight on f5, but this is an inaccuracy. The engine much preferred the central pawn break to d4. Now Black has a chance to punish with knight to c5, which would have put White under serious pressure. But So misses it. He plays rook to d8, and this lets Keymer completely off the hook. That golden opportunity to play knight to c5 is gone, and the advantage swings right back to White. And another inaccuracy. Keymer plays his bishop to e3, but for the second time he misses the much stronger pawn break to d4. After this slip, the position is back to roughly equal. Black's knight maneuvers to find a new post, and White finally plays the central pawn push to d4. Pawns are traded, the center opens, and after a knight jump to f4, White's bishop establishes a pin on b5. So calmly steps his queen to e6, simply breaking the pin and preparing to challenge for control of the center. Keymer decides to trade, capturing the bishop on d6. But this is another slip. Keeping the pressure with bishop to c4 was better. So could have punished this with knight takes the pawn on h3 with check. So misses the tactic. Instead, his knight becomes an absolute monster, jumping first to the powerful d5 outpost, then rerouting to f4, and finally crashing through to capture the pawn on h3. The knight continues its tour, landing on g5 to eye the weak kingside, while Keymer brings his rook over to the c-file. So plays his rook to c8, but this is a miss. He had a chance to create huge problems with queen to g3, putting immense pressure on White's king. And Keymer responds with an inaccuracy of his own, queen to h2. Stepping the king to g2 was much safer. Now Black gets another chance with a tactic starting with knight takes the pawn on f3. But he misses it again. Wesley plays queen to e7, a quiet move, when he had the crushing knight takes the pawn on f3. After a queen trade, Black's attack would have been decisive. A huge opportunity let slip. Given a third life, Keymer doesn't miss. He consolidates, activates his bishop, snaps up the pawn on c7, and then, crucially, trades off Black's incredibly dangerous knight on g5, so recaptures on g5 with the pawn, but this is another slip. The better move was to trade rooks by capturing the bishop on a6, which would have relieved a lot of White's pressure, and that allows Keymer's queen to leap into the powerful e5 square, dominating the board. So is forced onto the back foot, defending with bishop to f7. Keymer plays bishop to c4, but this is an inaccuracy that lets the advantage slip. The more precise move was bishop to b5, which would have caused Black a world of problems. The game is equal again, but So gives the advantage right back with the queen check on e3. This is just a nuisance check. The much stronger defensive idea was bringing the rook to e8 to challenge White's control. Keymer is unfazed, simply stepping his king up to g2 to get out of the way of the check. And here comes the decisive mistake of the game. So needed to find a very precise defensive setup. The better try was rook from f8 to e8, and after queen to b5, Black can trade bishops on c4. White recaptures on c4, and with rook to d8, Black is still fighting. But in the game, So plays the other rook to e8, and this is a game-losing blunder that allows a crushing attack. And Keymer finds it. the brilliant rook takes the bishop on f7, an incredible sacrifice, and it's the only move that converts this into a winning position, so plays his rook to g8. But this is the final nail in the coffin. It's a blunder that allows a forced checkmate. White can now win on the spot, with rook takes the pawn on g7, and the attack is unstoppable. Incredible. With a forced mate on the board, Keymer has a chance to end the game instantly, and the winning line was absolutely beautiful. The idea was, the rook smashes into g7, after queen to e2 with check. The rook blocks on f2. Queen to f1 is one last check, but the rook simply takes the queen on f1, and it's all over. But in this chaotic position, Keymer plays queen to d6, and he misses the mate. The game goes on, though white is still completely winning, so plays rook to c8, but in this desperate situation, the best defense was queen to c3, trying to create some counter threats. Keymer plays queen to d5, but the engine points out that rook to c7 was even more clinical, tightening the screws on black's position. Black plays his rook to d8, but the defense remains imprecise. Pushing the pawn to b5 would have created more problems for white to solve. Keymer is relentless. His rook lands on the 7th rank, a powerful attacking post, and he prepares his other rook to join the assault, so pushes the pawn to h6. But this just creates more weaknesses around his already exposed king, making white's job even easier. The queen moves to e6, but it's another slight inaccuracy. The direct pawn push to e5 would have been the most forceful continuation, so brings his queen to c3, but a better defensive try was to challenge the d-file immediately with rook to d8. The bishop lands on d5, but the conversion is still not perfectly clean. Again, the simple rook to c7 was the most punishing move. The queen swings over to a1, but in this incredibly difficult position, it's just another inaccuracy. White's advantage remains overwhelming. Keymer plays queen to f7, but the theme continues. The computer keeps pointing out that rook to c7 was the most decisive path to victory. The rook moves to f8, but so misses a chance to muddy the waters by snatching the pawn on a4, which would have created a passed pawn of his own. Keymer's queen moves to g6, but this lets a bit of the advantage slip away. Keeping the queen on the e-file with a move to e6 was stronger, so sets up a defensive battery on the f-file with his rooks, forcing Keymer's queen to reposition to h5 to continue the attack. And here, Keymer makes a serious mistake that could have cost him the game. There was a much more direct path to victory. The stronger line was, the pawn push to e5 was crushing. After black grabs the pawn on a4, the pawn marches to e6, queen to b5 is met by queen to h1, and black is helpless. But instead of that, Keymer plays queen to h3, and this is a big mistake that gives So real chances to get back into the game. And that's exactly what he does. So's queen snaps up the pawn on d4, and Keymer repositions his own queen to g3. The queen grabs another pawn on a4, but this was not the best idea. Lifting the rook to f4 would have posed much more direct threats to white's king. Keymer plays his rook to a7, but this is another inaccuracy in this chaotic phase. Queen to c7 was the stronger move, keeping black's pieces tied down. So's queen returns to the central d4 square, and Keymer brings his rook back to d7 to keep an eye on things. So pushes his pawn to a4, but for the second time he misses the much stronger idea of lifting the rook to f4. With the threat of the a-pawn reduced, Keymer pushes his own passer to e5, and So finally brings his rook to the active f4 square. The pawn marches to e6, but this allows black some counterplay. The more precise move was rook to e2, controlling key files. So plays rook to e8, but he missed a real chance for counterplay with queen to e5, which would have created serious problems for white, and now Keymer plays that very move, bringing the rook to e2 to take control of the position once more. The passed pawn advances to a3, but it's not the main threat in the position. White's passed e-pawn is far more dangerous, and there it goes. Keymer pushes his pawn to e7, and it's now just one square away from becoming a new queen. This is the final mistake in a game full of them. Black's position is on the brink, and he needed to find the only defensive move. The best try was queen to f6, and after white's queen moves to f2, the rook can go to d4. Even after rook to d8, the king steps to h7, and the fight continues. But in the actual game, So plays his rook to f6, and this allows a decisive combination from white that will end the game. And Keymer finds the killer blow. The rook infiltrates to d8, and with the pawn on e7, the attack is overwhelming. So makes one last move with his queen to a4, but the position is completely lost. There's nothing to be done. And Keymer plays queen to b8, threatening checkmate and forcing immediate resignation. A crushing final move. What an absolutely wild game, full of mistakes, missed opportunities, and brilliant tactics. In the end, after a chaotic battle, Vincent Keymer emerges victorious. A fantastic win for the young star.